Denise Onen, your work sounding the body as a site. And I saw arrows on the floor, and I saw a kind of immigration airport situation. What will we hear? How will it be when it is opened?
So to touch on the arrows and the, let's say, structures that were leading towards immigration and all of that, with Oscillations being about this transcontinental, transhemispheric exploration of sound, I thought it's important to bring in that aspect of movement and migration, actually moving across borders. And I thought it's really important to highlight, for example, the visa process that not only I went through, but I guess every African national would have to go through to enter Schengen borders, because even though movement is so easy and smooth in Berlin, it is one of the most stressful, complex processes to get a visa, especially if one isn't familiar with the process, hasn't had access to that information before, doesn't know anyone who's gone through the visa process. And it's not that it's gate-kept information, it's just it's very hard to find answers. And in all of these, let's say, bureaucratic spaces and places, I find that they're generally not inviting or warm, even though you have to wait there for long and it is a stressful environment. It's not an environment that is built to cater to holding that stress or supporting the person who is going through that process or entering that space. And I just thought it's a great opportunity to highlight that, and how once one enters those borders, it isn't necessary that one would have we don't have a shared universal experience. And with, let's say, sounding the body as a site, as I was in Berlin for 2 months with the residency, I became very conscious of my body within spaces and places, and how I moved through spaces, how I was aware of my body, and exploring the environment. So it wasn't just through sound, I became very conscious of my movements and my body language, and it's also a new cultural environment. Those levels of engaging and also being in public spaces, how am I perceived? What am I perceived as? And I wanted to also comment on that through sound, and I thought it's very important to also bring in the aspect of gestures and body language. And that became a huge part of the piece. I've always wanted to work with gesture-based sounds, but this just seemed like the perfect timing. Because speaking to a lot of internationals I know who come from unsafe countries, who come to, let's say, spaces like Berlin, which are more safe, like as a woman or feminine body, I can walk through the streets at night and not worry about horrible things that have happened to me. Whereas, let's say back in South Africa, I have that innate, let's say, fear in my nervous system because I have had terrible things happen to me. And now, even though I am in a safe environment, that safety and quiet that surrounds, even though it should be something that is affirming to the nervous system, it actually puts one in a state of hypervigilance. And that is quite a common occurrence. And I spoke to a lot of people I know who've come from, let's say, South Africa, who've moved here. And there is this transition within, let's say, the first few days, weeks, months, it depends on the person, where you are on edge the whole time. You're always looking over your shoulders, checking your pockets. And even though you don't need to do those things, it's really hard for the nervous system to take in that you are safe. And that is just a very interesting phenomenon I thought is important to highlight, just that somatic experience.
Wow, yes, I know what you're talking about. So I guess everybody, although of course the political surroundings are different, has had this physical experience, as you say, this bodily experience. How does it translate sonically? How do you work with the sounds in this situation?
So as I was moving through the spaces, another thing that I did was I always had my Zoom recorder with me and took a lot of field recordings. I think when I returned to South Africa, I had about 6 hours worth of audio. and just sat and would listen through the clips and highlight certain segments I'd want to extract and manipulate. And another aspect was also just now being on public transport, recording everything, but also being conscious of what am I recording, who am I recording, what sounds are being made in that space. And being in a new sonic environment, it's also that thing of what sounds exist in this space, why do they exist in this space? Are they made by people? Are they made by objects or things that were made by people? And that was a very interesting thing to come across, because before I came here, I'd done quite a bit of research about Berlin and Neukölln, and I found this overlap between Woodstock and Capetown, where I live, Middle Woodstock, where there's a lot of gentrification that's happening, linked to forced removals and something like the sound of construction. As soon as you start asking why does this sound exist in this space, it opens up a lot more questions. So you'll hear a lot of hooting and taxis, and something that's very particular to Cape Town is you have taxi conductors, or gachis as they call them, who shout the names of the areas, and that is very specific to Cape Town. And it's this thing of suburbs, places, it kind of has a voice sort of like an accent. And I was interested in like, what is the voice of Woodstock? And every day you hear the call to prayer, because it's a largely Muslim area. And historically, because of apartheid and the Group Areas Act, it was a coloured area. And the Cape Malay culture is very strong there still. And the call to prayer is something really beautiful that I hear multiple times of day. And in Woodstock, I tend to do a lot of the recordings from my window, because I don't go walking around at night, because it's not safe to. And I found it this really interesting juxtaposition that I'm doing all these recordings from my window in Woodstock, but in Berlin, I am going all over the place doing the recordings. And I find that in Woodstock, you have sounds in the space that reflect the people in the environment. Like you're hearing a lot of taxis, because there's a lot of working class people. Here you hear a lot of the S-Bahns or the U-Bahns all day throughout the day. If you're hearing hooting, then it might be linked to a Turkish wedding that's happening. And it was just beautiful to try and unpack these layers of how do the sounds reflect the people in the space. And the first thing that stood out to me was, of course, being in Woodstock and being familiar with that sonic environment, being exposed to all of these new sounds all around Berlin, but specifically Neukölln, where I was staying at the time. And was also very surprised that even though it's a largely Arab and Muslim area, you don't hear the call to prayer here. And I mean, that's linked to the German constitution about religious announcements not being allowed. But I'd also read that, I think it's 2 years ago in München, they passed a law where they can do the call to prayer. And church bells, for example, even though a church is a religious monument, it's not seen as religious because the church bells are markers of time. So that was very interesting to unpack these layers, and that helped with also selecting which sounds are specific markers of the space and place during this time. And I was speaking to someone the other day, and they were saying that every sound artist in Berlin will have the S-Bahn, the U-Bahns, and the sirens. And that was a completely new sound, was the sirens. It's normal to Berliners, but speaking to a lot of people who aren't from Berlin, if you were to look at it through a lens of, let's say, semiotics, a siren is an alarming sound, something of alertness, and it's quite a jarring, disturbing sound in a sense. So it's funny that to me, every time I'd hear a siren, I'd be on edge, but to Berliners, it's just another sound that's just irritating.
Which sirens do you mean?
The police,
emergency cars?
the emergency cars, the police sirens, the ambulances, the fire trucks. And it's a really funny thing, because it's like, are there always fires? Is there danger? But it's so safe here. Why are the sirens going on all the time? So in the sound piece, it was making a collage of all of these sounds and bringing these two worlds together and weaving them into a soundscape that will immerse the listener into an environment where it's sort of a reconstruction of these worlds. What is familiar, what is unfamiliar? What is familiar but has been augmented in a way to reflect what me coming in here and hearing it new. What does that sound like? What does that feel like? So it was bringing these worlds together and creating a whole soundscape. And the form of it, I'd say it's in 3 main sections, where it's like a lot of Woodstock, a lot of the nature sounds. There's a lot of Berlin and Neukölln. And then the last section, I wanted to capture that feeling of moving between places. So it's a bit more, I'd say, I don't want to say ethereal, but it's sort of that feeling of being in motion. And when I hear it, to me, the mental image I get is if you're on the S-Bahn and it happens to go through a tunnel and it's dark, and then it's suddenly light again and you might see some trees or the light filtering in through the trees. But in those times it's quite reflective, and sort of use that as a way to recall sonic motifs that I'd used earlier on in the piece. And linked to the gestural interactive aspect, what I did was, when one looks at somatics, or let's say the body, there are particular body parts that are indicators of body language or what someone's experience might be. So I wanted to highlight or have the camera pay attention to very specific body parts, such as the hands, and the arms are, I'd say, one of the first indicators of body language, whether it's open or closed. If someone's arms are crossed, is it defensive, is it protective? Is their body language open? Are they making eye contact? All of those little things in nuances, I wanted to highlight the subtleties so that it's not necessarily a performance, but it's shedding a light on all these subtle movements we make every day as we are, let's say, even trying to regulate our nervous systems. So that might be someone biting the nails or touching their face. So in the interactive system, for example, I had certain sounds assigned to if someone touches their face with their right hand or their left hand. And I sought to divide left and right in a way of kind of reflecting, let's say, east and west in, let's say, past with Berlin and the wall, and how, in terms of the public transportation system, you'll find trams on the west side, and east-west, I always mix it up because of the hemispheres. So with subtleties like that, that's where physical placement was used for bodily placement of the sounds as well.
So you need quite a game engine system to recognize the hands, for example, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Yes.
So initially I thought the easiest way, or not easiest, but from research I've done in the past, an Xbox Kinect is programmed in a way that it maps the body, and with the newer generation ones it can go as far as tracking your eye movements. Mm-hmm. But with that would need the participant to be really close. And I got in touch with a good friend of mine, Lucy Strauss. He's an incredible programmer. We've collaborated quite a bit and known each other for 10 years now because we studied together in undergrad. And I knew she'd be the perfect person to bring this to life, because I think with collaboration it's always good to have someone who also understands the way you think, because I can be a bit abstract and she'll know exactly what I'm saying, even if I might go a long-winded way of saying things. And she has an extensive knowledge of machine learning. So with that, I could say I'd like the particular movement of, I was joking with friends the other day, of when old men go walking through the field, they tend to have their arms behind their back. But it is a very natural, secure pose. And it's that difference between, are your hands behind your back, are they in front as you're moving? So with the machine learning system, I asked her to get it to recognize certain poses, gestures, and movements. And because of her extensive knowledge, she was able to get it to understand and recognize those specific things based on, let's say, the joint points in the body, and also in terms of accessibility, if someone might be in a wheelchair, if you're sitting or standing, it will look at, let's say, the distance between your shoulders and your hips. And it was really interesting to also delve into that aspect of using technology in this way.
Wow.
Yeah. It was quite, something I found very interesting is the system can use any 2D camera, so even just a normal webcam, And it looks for eyes as well, so that it knows if you're facing it or looking away. And with the piece in itself, I was also interested in the aspect of the gaze, whether that is when one is moving through spaces, the gaze of the people in the surrounding space, the way one views themselves. And in this particular installation, it's kind of like the gaze of the camera. And with the gaze, there's also this aspect of perception, or in terms of surveillance, as one being perceived as a threat. And in terms of hypervigilance, the body language would reflect that. So it was very interesting to also see that the system inbuilt has this thing of trying to look for where is one's eyes, where is your head facing.
Mm-hmm. And how will you relate that to the audience? Is it immediately obvious, or will you explain? Will there be a glossary of gestures? Or I'm just wondering how.
It's a good question. So what I did is, also with the physical setup of the installation itself and looking like a lot of these bureaucratic spaces, I find that when you walk into a lot of them, there's either missing information or it's like a little sign that you have to really squeeze to have a look at because other people need to read the information as well. So I made printouts where it's to deal with like notifications about privacy, alerting the participant that there is a camera, and that of course linked to consent. Participation is voluntary and they can move into space. And then there's also another informative paper that has a bit of information about the camera and how it works. But a lot of these gestures being based on those somatic movements. Also, I made a note about participants possibly being uncomfortable because it's this whole new experience and you're having people sitting there and you're being watched, which is that aspect of the gaze that these movements are very intuitive actually. And when I was testing the system, there were people having a conversation in the space and already you could see someone had their arms crossed, or depending on what was being said as they opened up, their body language started changing. So it's actually very subtle natural movements, and I didn't want to draw too much attention to that because I'm very curious to actually see how people interact in the space. So I didn't want to give too much information, but just a little bit. So there's a bit on the system itself, and that it is looking at your body language and body parts and looking for your eyes as well.
Wow, I'm so curious now. Let me finally ask you, how did you experience your position in this whole project, or not your position, but how did you experience the project and your position in the exhibition? Because they're very different works, but still there's a common topic, and as I know you had workshops and discussed, and in a way you're shaping what is sound art with what you do.
It's been an incredible experience because I would say in my daily practice I'm a sound designer and a composer, but it's been great to explore sound art in this way, but also just to engage with other creatives and artists who deal with sound every day, some in a completely different way to the way in which I deal with it. And I think that's been such a beautiful aspect of learning, because it's just this process of continuous discovery. And that might happen through a conversation with another artist. It could happen through seeing what they do and hearing about the ways in which they think about sound. And it's been an incredible point of learning. I think it's also really beautiful that all the artists have such different backgrounds, expertise, knowledges of music, sound, the world. And I think also linked to the South African context, I found it very interesting thinking about all of this, that if I'm not mistaken, I think I'm the only artist that is what they call a born free. So you're born after the end of apartheid. So I'm the only one who was born after 1994. So it's also just been interesting to have these threads of history and how that also links to looking at what is sound in a not only post-colonial but post-apartheid context, and to also have this engagement between South Africa and Germany in the current context. It's a really important time, and an important way of meeting the world is through art. And this is a really essential, beautiful medium for being able to explore the unknown, but also think about what possibilities might be. And that is what Oscillations is doing, and it's really a privilege to be a part of that and entrusted with that.
And you are adding a wonderful, wonderful works to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.